Well, this morning we're going to be blessed by Brother Tom, and he's chosen the subject, the prophet and the prince. The prophet and the prince. Brother Tom.
Thank you, Brother Ken. Good morning, brethren. I love that manna text. I hope our consideration this morning will be along those lines, that the scriptures will give us guidance. I'm not going to keep you in suspense about who it is I will be speaking about, but I found it very interesting that the words of the prophet Malachi should be directly connected to the work of Nehemiah after the Babylonian captivity. So Malachi is the prophet, and Nehemiah is the prince that we're going to see are connected to one another. You know, if you get a chance to read the book of Malachi, it's kind of depressing. It's a very strong criticism about towards Israel, about the way they worshipped and served God. But when you read the book, he doesn't tell you the specific instances or circumstances that he's referring to. He just makes some general criticisms about the impropriety and the way they were serving, particularly in the temple. But here's a quote from Brother Russell where he ties the prophet and the prince together. This is from reprint 2540. If you get a chance to read that, I would encourage you to do that. The article is titled, God Loveth a Cheerful Giver. And we'll see why that's an interesting title as we look into what Malachi said in the book. He said, Malachi uttered his prophecy during the period of Nehemiah's absence from Jerusalem at the court of Persia. And the return of Nehemiah may at the time have seemed like a fulfillment of Malachi's prophecy. The Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, and so forth. No doubt, the testimony of the Lord given through Malachi prepared the people for their quick response to Nehemiah's energetic appeals and commands. And then in reprint 3683, he adds this. He says, the interim of his absence is thought to have been one of religious declension, as the record shows a considerable stirring up and setting in order again after his return. Malachi's prophecy, therefore, may have served a double purpose. First, to reprove and stimulate the people of that time, and secondly, and much more important, to give a general lesson applicable all the way down through the 20 centuries since. You know, I find that connection fascinating, that the time setting for the book of Malachi was sometime after Israel's release from Babylonian captivity, but before Nehemiah's second visit to Jerusalem. Before we get into some of those details, however, I'd like to show you a general timeline of what transpired in Israel when the Jews returned after the captivity. I think this gives us a sense of how long it took for the Jews to reestablish themselves in Israel and when Nehemiah came on the scene. Now, the first return of Jews was in the first year of the reign of King Cyrus, king of Persia. Zerubbabel returned, became the governor of Israel, and he returned with 42,360 Jews. Very specific number that were given. Now, following Cyrus came a king by the name of Cambyses, who reigned for 8 years, followed by Darius the First, who reigned for 36 years. And it was during the reign of Darius that the temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem. And then came King Xerxes. Now, in this king's term, there's a difference of opinion of how long he reigned. Brother Russell says that he reigned for 12 years. The Edgar brothers say it was 11. Brother David Rice says it was 21 years. Now, I'm not here to debate how long that was, so we're just going to put 12 years in there to make a point. And then following Xerxes was his son Artaxerxes. Then when we look in the book of Ezra, Ezra 7:7, we read that Ezra returned in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. Ezra was a hero of Israel. In fact, the Jews recognize him as one of the greatest Jews to reestablish the worship of God properly in Israel. He was a scribe and a priest. And according to Jewish tradition, he wrote the books of Chronicles and was responsible for gathering all the various books of the Old Testament into a single collection of writings. So he was extremely important to the nation of Israel. Now here's another interesting tradition that says that Ezra may actually have written the book of Malachi. The word Malachi means messenger. So rather than being a proper name, it may simply be indicating the work that Ezra did as God's messenger to Israel. He was the deliverer of what was said in the book of Malachi. And when I first considered the time setting for the book of Malachi, I thought, well, if Malachi was there when Nehemiah was on the scene, why isn't he mentioned in the books of Ezra or Nehemiah? But if Ezra actually wrote what is recorded in Malachi, then he's giving an eyewitness account of the conditions at the time and would explain why the name Malachi isn't mentioned, where Ezra, on the other hand, is very prominent. In fact, another thought is that the book of Malachi was written by, like I said, by Ezra, but it was almost a reenactment of a discussion that Ezra was having with the leaders of Israel, and somehow that word may have got back to Nehemiah, which caused him to return back to Israel. Why would he come back, except if he understood the problems that Ezra was describing? Then looking at our chart again from Nehemiah 1:1, we see that Nehemiah came to Jerusalem for the first time in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. So there was a long period of at least 85 years from their first returnees under Zerubbabel to Nehemiah's first visit. So you can see then that a lot happened before Nehemiah actually returned. So by putting the writing of Malachi in context with the work of Nehemiah, we do get an idea of the specific things that Malachi is referring to when he writes his book. Well, let's go to the book of Nehemiah then to get a feel for some of the specific things that were happening. Now, you may remember that Nehemiah was a cupbearer of the Persian king Artaxerxes. Now, that doesn't sound like that would be a job of a prince, but in the article I mentioned earlier, I quoted Brother Russell, and he says this. He says, Nehemiah, he occupied a confidential position with Artaxerxes, the Persian king, somewhat similar to the office held by Mordecai under Xerxes, the father of Artaxerxes. His official title, cupbearer, does not give the proper conception of the dignity of his position. In those days, kings needed to be continually guarded against poisons, which could be easily mingled without detection with their liquid refreshments. Consequently, the cupbearer was one whose loyalty was esteemed irreproachable, and his duties afforded him privileges and opportunities for intimate intercourse with the king more than others. They became confidants of royalty and court advisors, really occupying the position of minister of state. Now, as you read through the book of Nehemiah, the story develops like this. I'm sure you know this, so this is a Bible class review of Nehemiah. In chapter 1, the brother of Nehemiah, a man by the name of Hananiah, he came to Persia and he saw Nehemiah. And Nehemiah asked, how are the Jews doing in Israel who returned from captivity? And especially, how are they doing in Jerusalem? Jerusalem was a very special interest to Nehemiah. And here was his answer. He said, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned certain days and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then in chapter 2, Nehemiah is before King Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes notes that he's very sad. His countenance had changed, and he asked Nehemiah what was wrong. And of course, Nehemiah told him what was bothering him. And so Artaxerxes then not only gave him permission to go to Israel, but appointed him as governor and actually provided a small army to accompany him back to Israel. He also provided a letter to the keeper of the king's forest so that he could have lumber to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. He also gave letters to the governors that Nehemiah would pass, whose lands he would pass through, so that he would be guaranteed a safe passage. And so you see in all this the great respect that Artaxerxes had for Nehemiah. Remarkable, really, for a Persian king to feel that way about his Jewish cupbearer. It's really reminiscent of how Nebuchadnezzar felt for Daniel. A very warm and close and respectful position between them. Well, as Nehemiah returned, it took some 3 months for him to reach Jerusalem. Now we can fly at the 500 miles an hour to get there. Would have taken maybe an hour by today's travel. But it took Nehemiah 3 months to get there. And when he arrived, he found exactly what his brother had said, that the walls were in disrepair. And he proceeds to do something very wise. He sets those who lived near each section of the wall in charge of rebuilding their section, knowing that because they're defending their own home, they would build that section very well. And they were very enthused by his support. And we're told that it took only 52 days to repair the walls of Jerusalem. All this work in Jerusalem, the reaction of the local Gentiles was hateful. The Gentile population of the land hated what the Jews were doing, and they tried to prevent it at every opportunity. In fact, the abuse from the Gentile community was so bad that Nehemiah finally told the Jews, as you're building, carry a spear with you in case you need to defend yourself. And they did. And that allowed them to finish the work. And so after the walls and the gates were repaired, he assigned the Levites to their position, the singers, and all the duties of the temple were then assigned to the appropriate people. And finally, Ezra was commissioned to read the law to the people, and as they heard it, they rejoiced with great joy. It was a wonderful celebration for them. And then in chapter 7 of Nehemiah, Nehemiah's brother, again, Hananiah, was given charge of Jerusalem by Nehemiah. And so he was to continue the work of building all the homes, all the things that had been torn down from before. And then a man by the name of Hananiah was given charge of the palace to rebuild and repair the palace. And after he did that, Nehemiah returned to Persia. This is Nehemiah 5:15. It says, "Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year, even unto the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, that is 12 years, I and my brethren have not eaten the bread of the governor." Now, just look at that last phrase first, where he says, we have not eaten the bread of the governor. What he's saying there is, I recognize that I, as governor, should have been provided for by the people. Not only an income, but also my food should have been provided. But because I saw the condition of Israel, I didn't take what I really had coming to me as governor. So it was a very noble gesture that he wasn't going to get paid or compensated for the work he would do as governor. But looking at this 12 years, let's look at the timeline again and see where that 12 years fits in. He says that he was appointed governor from the 20th year of Artaxerxes. We read from the first chapter that was the first year that he came to Israel. And so the 12 years he mentions here covers really the entire span of when he was in Israel on the first visit. I'm going to expand that last part because it's kind of small there on the chart. There's the 12 years of Nehemiah's first visit to Jerusalem. Then after he returned to Persia, we don't know how long he was gone. The scriptures are not specific. But on reprint 2534, Brother Russell suggests that he was gone back to Persia for some 5 years. It was during this absence that Brother Russell describes as a spiritual decline for the spiritual aspect of the Jews in Israel. And so that's where he puts Malachi's prophecy, during the period after he returned to Persia, but before his second visit to Jerusalem. So Malachi, or Ezra, if the Jewish tradition is correct, described what happened during this 5-year period. So now let's go to Malachi and see what he says there. In the first few verses of the book, God is speaking to Israel. And he says that he loved them. But Israel questioned it. He says, how have you loved us? And there God reminds them of their heritage. He says, I've loved your father Jacob more than I loved his brother Esau. And then notice what God says to Israel in verses 6 through 8. He says, a son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If then I be a father, where is mine honor? And if I be a master, where is my reverence, saying the Lord of hosts unto you, O priests that despise my name? And ye say, wherein have we despised thy name? Ye offered polluted bread upon mine altar. And ye say, wherein have we polluted thee? In that ye say the table of the Lord is contemptible. And if ye offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? Offer it now unto the governor. Will he be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? Now that governor was Nehemiah. Was Nehemiah satisfied with what he saw when he came to Jerusalem? Absolutely not. He was passionately against the decline of the religion that the Jews were practicing. This whole passage of Scripture is a very strong condemnation, isn't it? And it's primarily against the priesthood. Here's another example. We see it time and time again in the history of Israel. The sins of Israel usually began with the leadership. When the leadership was good, the people generally followed and were blessed by God, and they did the right thing. Nehemiah and Ezra were outstanding examples of this. But when the leadership was bad and wasn't faithful and wasn't careful, the people followed that as well, and they almost always suffered. Now, a specific example of the carelessness that Malachi was referring to can be found in Nehemiah, the 13th chapter. There we see that on Nehemiah's second visit, he found the temple and the priesthood in total disarray. This is Nehemiah 13:4 and 5. And before this, Eliashib the priest, having oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied with Tobiah. And he prepared for him a great chamber where aforetime was laid the meal offering, the frankincense, and the vessels and the tithes of the corn, the new wine and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites and the singers and the porters, and the offerings of the priests. Well, this Tobiah is an interesting character. We read about him earlier in the book of Nehemiah in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 10. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man, that is Nehemiah, to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. And so this Tobiah wasn't a Jew, he was a Gentile. He could care less about the welfare of Israel. In fact, it says here he was grieved, he was angry that Nehemiah would come back and help to restore the work in the building of Jerusalem. Now back in Nehemiah 13, we see Eliashib the priest giving this same Tobiah the storehouse of the temple as an apartment for him to live in. And you look at that and say, well, there's a lot wrong here. There were two major faults. And the first was that the storehouse was empty to begin with. Where were the tithes and the offerings that the people should have given that should have filled the storehouse and not allowed it to be so empty? And of course, second, Eliashib had violated the sanctity of the temple. He desecrated the temple, and it showed his lack of appreciation that he wasn't fighting for the sanctity of the temple, but he was allowing the Gentile influence to come in. In verse 10, we see a related problem. There, Nehemiah makes the following observation. He says, and I perceived that the portion of the Levites had not been given them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled everyone to his field. Well, you know the way it should have worked. The priests were supposed to receive the tithes from the people and then distribute them accordingly to the Levites and all the others who served in the temple. But because the priests were negligent, that they were not enforcing the tithe, not encouraging the people to do their part, the Levites had to go out into the fields to make a living to support themselves. And that's probably why Eliashib rented out the storehouse. He did it for the rent, to support the things that he needed, because they weren't being provided by the people. I look at that and I think it's somewhat startling that in such a short time, things could get so bad. But as you look deeper, you find that it wasn't that simple. There's more to it than what meets the eye on the surface. Now, we heard of this name Sanballat earlier when we read his association with Tobiah. Sanballat was an influential Samaritan, like his servant Tobiah. He hated what the Jews were doing, and he tried to prevent it at every opportunity. And from Nehemiah 13, we learned that his daughter was actually married to the grandson of Eliashib, the priest. And we also read that on one occasion he even plotted to kill Nehemiah. And now we see that his servant was actually living in the temple storehouse. Brethren, these are not coincidences that are happening here. These are calculated attempts to counteract the work of the Jews in keeping themselves separate from the Gentiles and reestablishing themselves in the land of Israel. I think the Samaritans and the other Gentiles saw the Jews as competition for the land and for the dominance of the region. And I think as we look at the actions of Sanballat, we see an example of how the adversary works. If he cannot outright defeat the Lord's people, he will gradually work his way in and corrupt them. He has been using that tactic ever since the Garden of Eden. And it is something that we each must be aware of, how gradually and almost unnoticedly he works his way into our lives if we're not aware of it. In Malachi 3, 7, and 8, this neglect of the temple is described by God as robbing him. It says, even from the days of your father, you're gone away from mine ordinances and have not kept them. Return unto me, and I will return unto you, saith the Lord of hosts. But ye say, wherein shall we return? Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Well, in this discussion, clearly the Jews were oblivious to how they had left God. I think they felt, well, we came back to the land. There's a lot of Jews who didn't come back, but we had the courage to come. We helped rebuild the temple. We still believe in the God of Abraham. And yet God said that they left him by not giving their tithes and offerings. What they had done in the past was good, but they didn't stick with it. They weren't continually faithful and committed to that. They owed those things to God. It was part of the covenant that they had made with him. And Malachi made the point earlier that even when they did give their offerings, it was the blind and the lame animals that were brought. God did not need their tithes and offerings. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, the scriptures say. But when he saw their attitude, it grieved him, because it meant that there was something wrong with their heart condition, that they weren't seeing properly how God had cared for them and provided for them, and they owed their appreciation for him by how they gave back. God called their offerings polluted, contemptible, evil, even robbery. My goodness, these are strong words. I would hate to have the words said about me. But they were meant to impress upon them how important their continued service to God was. But once again, they may have felt, there are extenuating circumstances here that prevents us from doing better. And the reality was that most Jews in Israel at the time were really dirt poor. There was great poverty in the land. There had been a severe drought in the land. And many of the Jews actually had to mortgage their lands and their vineyards and even their homes just to buy food for their families. So they had an excuse. In fact, in the 5th chapter of Nehemiah, some of the more prominent or prosperous Jews were charging exorbitant interest rates to their fellow Jews, and they were repossessing these vineyards and lands and homes. In fact, it was so bad that Nehemiah angrily demanded that they return the lands and the vineyards and the houses, and that they give those all back to their original owners. And he actually said, I demand that you drop your interest rates to 1%. It actually says that in the 5th chapter. And remarkably, the wealthy Jews agreed, which showed that Nehemiah's good influence did make a difference. But the poverty persisted and likely contributed to the shortage of the tithes and offerings. Another problem Nehemiah found when he came back to Jerusalem was that the Sabbath was no longer being properly observed. In fact, Jerusalem was filled with Gentile street vendors on the Sabbath. They were able to come and go and sell and buy and do everything they did on a normal day. They wanted to sell their goods to the Jews. And when Nehemiah saw that, he was so incensed that he threw the Gentiles out of the city and demanded that the gates of the city be closed to prevent people from going in and out until after the Sabbath. And when the Gentiles started lodging outside of the gate, Nehemiah actually went to them and threatened them with physical harm if they didn't go away. And this is how he dealt with Tobiah. He says, I came to Jerusalem and understood the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me sore. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chamber, and thither brought I again the vessels of the house of God with the meal offering and the frankincense. Even the furniture that was being stored there, the items had been taken out, cleared out to make room for Tobiah. Brother, Nehemiah was a man who believed in what he was doing, and that God's law deserved strict observation. And of course, the natural question when you look at the circumstances is, how could the Jews pay their tithes and offerings and bring them when poverty was so widespread and the conditions were so bad in the land? But when you read the story, you see that Nehemiah expressed no sympathy for the poverty of the Jews or because the Gentiles oppressed them so much. And what's interesting about this whole thing is that as soon as he cleansed the temple and admonished the people, the tithes and the offerings began to come in. Somehow, the people found a way to give their 10% and to offer the first fruits of their harvests and to bring their animal sacrifices. They just needed passionate encouragement and the right motivation. And when Nehemiah provided that, they responded. Well, brother, I'm going to pause here for a minute and do something that I didn't want to do. But I'd like to look at this and ask, what lesson can we learn from all of this? Now, poverty isn't something that we particularly deal with too much, but worldly influence is all around us, and it can affect our thinking. Remember that gradual way that Satan often creeps in. We live in a society where materialism is extremely prominent. And I think it would be good for us to imagine if Nehemiah was standing here today and warning us to be careful and not to get caught up in the world's affairs or in the way they think. We also see in this story that despite Israel's poverty, they were able to meet their obligations when they put their minds to it. And I can't help thinking that when an issue comes up for us, like our ecclesia treasury getting smaller, for example, that rather than thinking we should curtail our services to the Lord, it would be better to find a way to fill our storehouse so we don't have to cut back on our service to the Lord. Now, I think it would be different if we could not do something. The Lord would certainly understand things that prevent us from doing it. But if we can do something, but we prefer not to, or we prefer not to give when the service is needed, then that's a different matter entirely, and one that should concern us very much. So, before we cancel one of our conventions because we want to be fiscally responsible, remember how the Jews, despite their poverty and difficult circumstances, met their obligations when they were properly motivated by Nehemiah, a passionate man who believed that nothing should interfere with their service to God. Now, I'm not saying any of this to make us feel bad or that we're being unfaithful if we cancel a convention. But we also want to listen to the warnings of Scripture and be careful in all the decisions that we make in life. That's my appeal as we consider any future ecclesia or personal activities. When we are likewise passionate about our service, we will find a way to work out the details. On an ecclesial level, we can accomplish more as a group than any one individual can do, and together we can bring honor to the one who has given us all so much. I'll tell you that account of this story, for me, the timing was amazing. And I found it a sobering reminder for me as to how much I owe the Lord. And I do not want to fall short in expressing my thanksgiving to God in any way that I can. Well, looking back at the work of Nehemiah, we see a clear parallel to what Jesus did at the first advent and is also doing at the second advent. Malachi 3, 1 through 3, says this. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant, whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. But who may abide the day of his coming? And who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. I like Brother Russell's thought about this, that the Israelites who first read these words believed that they likely referred to Nehemiah coming to the temple with authority to revive the worship of God, that Nehemiah was a messenger of the covenant to restore the priesthood in the temple worship. Now, if you look back at Nehemiah 13:29, you'll see what covenant Malachi is referring to. Nehemiah says, remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. Thus cleansed I them from all strangers and appointed the wards of the priests and the Levites, everyone in his business. And so the covenant of the priesthood in Nehemiah's day was the priesthood as it was established under the Mosaic law. All the details and circumstances that the law provided is the covenant of the priesthood. In fact, an interesting thing that Nehemiah did earlier in chapter 10, he had all the leaders of Israel come together and actually physically sign an agreement, a covenant, that they would keep the law. And they gladly did that. But when he left, they failed. And Nehemiah had to return and set his house in order. And again, I would say, I wouldn't doubt that what Ezra wrote in the book of Malachi is what prompted Nehemiah to come back, that he needed to come back to help his people. Now, the larger application of this, of course, as I said, is to the first and second advents. Jesus is the messenger of the greater covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. And the parallel to Nehemiah's action when he cleansed the temple is found in the words of Luke 19:45. And Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold therein and them that bought, saying unto them, it is written, my house is the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. So when the Lord, whether it was Nehemiah in Malachi's day or Jesus at the first advent, came to the temple, the question that Malachi puts forward is, who may abide the day of his coming, and who shall stand when he appeareth? That's not a rhetorical question. There is an answer to that question. Now, the first advent heard the words of John the Baptist when he said, I indeed baptize you with water unto repentance, but he that cometh after me is mightier than I, whose shoes I am not worthy to bear. He shall baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire, whose fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor and gather his wheat into the garner, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. There's the twofold result of the Lord purging the temple. Those who are in it for the wrong reasons will be purged out, while those who understand why we are here and how we should serve will be gathered as wheat into his barn. Well, brethren, we have a unique perspective at the end of the age. We can look back on the gospel age and see that for the most part, Christianity has succumbed to the same temptation that drew Israel's priesthood away from faithfully administering their office. It started early at the beginning of the age. When Eliashib rented out the temple storehouse for money, he was actually foreshadowing the greater evil that would happen in the gospel age. Of course, we don't need to reiterate it too much. We all know the history of papacy's rise to power that would even persecute and kill good, consecrated men and women. Here, for example, is a painting of the trial of John Huss. The verdict for Huss was actually predetermined before he ever went to trial. He was given little or no opportunity to speak in his defense, and as soon as it was over, he was burned at the stake. The misuse of power and the striving for wealth can be documented in the gospel age almost ad infinitum. The church's ambitions and excesses make the sins of the Jewish priesthood pale in comparison. Today it is an institution that has grown to become one of the wealthiest organizations in the world. Here's a quote from a website. It has an interesting name. It's called My First Class Life. And the purpose of the website is to reveal some of the net worth of some famous people in the world. But in this quote, they're addressing the wealth of papacy. It says the Vatican has a very dense and widespread investment portfolio holding billions of shares in the most powerful international corporations. Just to give you an example, the Vatican is heavily invested in Gulf Oil, General Motors, General Electric, IBM, Shell, and many others. In the United States alone, the Vatican is deeply invested in the Morgan Bank, the Chase Manhattan, the Bankers Trust Company, and a number of others. You know, brethren, I look at that wealth, and I think, it might be less convicting if they use their wealth to help the poor and the homeless. But of course, that is not their goal. That is not their mission. As we study in the third volume explains that the Lord began the process of cleansing the sanctuary at the Reformation. People started to see the sins of the system and the doctrine of errors, and it began to be cleansed and is now in the process of being consumed and burned. Brother Russell makes this point when he says, our Lord declares that the wheat of this age will be separated completely from the tares and gathered into the higher garner of his glorified kingdom. And then the purgatorial fire will come upon nominal Christendom, producing a time of trouble such as was not since there was a nation, which will burn up root and branch all of its false pretenses and evil systems, and thus prepare the world for the reign of the kingdom of Christ, the true church glorified. And I think into the future, when people look back at the history of mankind, they will recognize how religion, for the most part, had become so corrupted. And not just Christianity, but all religions. How greed and power often was the motivating force for those systems. And when they look back and they see how the Lord undermined and destroyed the systems, I think few people will ever question God's judgment that man's systems of religion just had to go for our benefit. So as we study the words of Malachi in their proper setting, we see that there are an abundance of lessons for us. For us personally, here are some final questions. As we look at what happened in Israel and try to apply them to ourselves, we ask, are we careful not to allow worldly thinking into our temple service, unlike the priests who rented out the storehouse of the temple? In our service to God, whether as an ecclesia or individually, is God the number one priority in our lives, unlike the Israelites who neglected their tithes and offerings? And do we do our part in helping others to serve? There's an interesting question there. How can we help others to devote their lives to the Lord? I know brethren have been responsible for opening up opportunities for me that I would never have seen by myself. Unlike Nehemiah's time when the Levites had to go out into the field, so they couldn't work in the temple. And of course, there are certain other warnings and messages that we can glean from this study. Sometimes giving our tithes does mean financially supporting an important truth activity. Other times our offerings are the ones that we can give when we give our willing sacrifice, physical sacrifices when necessary. As I said, we live in a day of prosperity and wealth, and we can all be influenced by that, including myself. And so if we are not careful, if we do not heed the warnings of Scripture, we can get caught up into the wrong frame of mind, wanting some of these worldly things, wanting the enjoyment that the world offers, while neglecting the more important responsibilities that God has given us. I love what Albert Einstein once said. He said, only a life lived in the service of others is worth living. I love that. That is a godly principle. And Jesus said, no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And I think about that, and I think, well, we all love the Lord. There's no question about that. But it's more difficult to hate the world. So the question probably relevant for us is, how can we love the Lord and still like the world? We can't. It fits into this principle. That's the point, that the prophet and the prince and our King, Jesus, want us to live by. In the closing verses of the Old Testament, the prophet says these words, "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it." What a precious promise. That's God's promise to us. And I can't imagine receiving so many blessings that I can't even receive them. But that's his promise if we do our part. May the Lord add his blessings.